A mission to monitor the evacuation of eastern Aleppo looks likely to be launched as the UN Security Council agrees the details. This follows terror attacks on aid workers and evacuees from the city. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis in the Iraqi city of Mosul worsens as the US-led military operation against ISIL there continues. We speak to Oxfam about the situation on the ground. And Iran promises retaliation after accusing the US of violating last year's landmark nuclear deal. Congress has approved the renewal of some sanctions it says are not related to the agreement. Hello, welcome. It's just gone midday here in Moscow. You're watching RT International. Now, the UN Security Council is expected to vote unanimously in favour of monitoring the evacuation of eastern Aleppo. The need for such a mission was highlighted by terror attacks on humanitarian workers and evacuees there. But the details of the document once again revealed some disagreements between member states, as Murad Gazdiev explains.
The evacuation of rebels from Aleppo was a hard-won agreement, yet not everyone wants to see it materialize. Those burning buses were intended to evacuate thousands of civilians from Fua and Kafraya, two pro-government villages besieged by rebels. That's the other side of this evac agreement. Rebels and their supporters get to leave Aleppo, and civilians from Fua and Kafraya get to leave those villages. Instead, rebels burn the buses, delaying and endangering the entire deal, according to the UN's senior Syria advisor.
Cowardly terrorist attack on civilian buses and killing driver must not end evacuations from Fua and Kafraya, East Aleppo, Madaya and Zabdani.
And this, apparently, is not the first attack by rebels on bus convoys. On the 15th, an aid worker working for the Red Crescent was gunned down in rebel-controlled territory. Several others injured then. So this bus-burning exercise, by all appearances, is an attempt to spoil this agreement.
The agreements have been breached so many times by the Al-Qaeda groups. I mean, they're in the habit of breaching these sorts of agreements. They're used to carrying out these sort of acts without any sort of restraint. So they've been turned loose by the big powers. The big powers have been supporting them. They've become very arrogant in things that they do. So it's very hard to predict if there's going to be more dangers like that.
Fortunately, things are looking up at the UN Security Council, which is expected to unanimously adopt a resolution on the evacuation in Aleppo. It isn't often that the United States and Russia can agree, but it does look like they're on the same page with regards to this. Samantha Power, the US representative, was literally mobbed by journalists after the talks.
We worked very constructively together with the representative of the Russian Federation on the text, and so I can't speak for how his system works, but we expect to vote unanimously for this text tomorrow at 9 a.m.
The resolution, initially proposed by the French, will empower the UN to send observers to watch over the evacuation. But Russia was unhappy with it, saying it made no arrangements for the security of monitors, leaving them to wander about in a war zone by themselves. They spent hours and hours haggling over the fine print, apparently successfully. And perhaps after everything that has happened, they may, at last, start working together rather than against each other.
Well, the liberation of eastern Aleppo has also made it possible to film what years of militant rule and heavy fighting have done to that part of the city. However, despite that destruction, residents are returning to the liberated areas, and for the first time in years they can go home without risking their lives. As Lizzie Phelan reports.
This is the first time I've been able to come to Aleppo's famous old city without wearing full protective gear or hearing the sounds of fighting and missiles landing nearby. It's also the first time in more than 4 years that members of the public have been able to stroll around this area, because up until just over a week ago, this UNESCO World Heritage Site was divided between pro and anti-government forces. But before the war, this was a famous tourist attraction, bustling with people who would come to see the sights here, not least one of the world's most famous citadels. Now people are returning here again to see what's left of these sites, and those who had shops and homes here are coming to check what's left of them. Wading through the rubble of this former battlefield, Aleppo's residents stop to take selfies amongst the new ruins and the old ones. Some, like Muna, remained in the old city, but rarely dared to venture out. She lit up when we asked her what it's like to see all these people walking around now.
Yesterday I was so excited and happy because at last I could go along the road to the castle. I brought some bread for my daughters and came back home safely. We are struggling now with water and there is no electricity. I'm transporting some water in this cart. What can we do?
Her bittersweet feeling is shared by Marwan, who fled to the other side of the front line when the rebels arrived in 2012.
We always kept this view in our mind. We just couldn't forget it, how beautiful Aleppo is. This view used to be in front of us every single day. I own this shop. I had some staff. We sold hookahs, coffee, tea, fresh juice, and some snacks. We lived in this store. It's a piece of our lives. What I'm seeing now is very painful. God willing, we will get back everything that we had.
Walking through the old city, and we noticed how beautiful this store is. It has this little knocker. We didn't expect anybody to be in, but we knocked the door and this lady was in her house. And she's just come back. She hasn't been living here for the last 4 or 5 years.
I was born here in the 60s. I came here just to relieve some memories.
Amar is another who stayed put, even as the walls of his home were taken out by the fighting around him.
It was terrible. We're glad to be alive. They stole all the aid supplies. I'm a market trader in the old city. I started repairing bicycles for the rebels to make a living, but they didn't pay me. The Syrian army rescued the people.
His neighbor has to walk over part of his roof, which was brought down by mortars, to get to the entrance of his home.
I didn't move anywhere because the rebels wanted to either use the houses as bases or just raid them. If anybody dared to leave their home to see what the rebels were doing, they would be killed. We had to pay for food supplies that were supposed to be handed out to us. Beans, rice, sugar, lentils, everything.
But his relative argues it was worse in rebel-held Fardous.
In the Fardous district, they slaughtered donkeys and would sell 1 kilo of the meat to us for $30. The bread I ate was from flour, glue and salt. My face got swollen. My friend asked me what was wrong with me. I explained to him that I'd eaten 3 pieces of that bread. At first I felt fine, but after a while my stomach shrank and I didn't know what was happening to me. I thought I was going to die.
At the foot of the citadel, a wreath commemorates the fallen of the battle for the old city. Side by side with the pain of the last few years is the city's yearning to honor its dead with life. Lizzie Phelan reporting for RT from Aleppo.
Meanwhile, fears are rising over the humanitarian situation in the Iraqi city of Mosul as the US-led military operation against ISIL there continues. Over 100,000 people have been displaced and those who remain are struggling to find food and water. A digital press officer for Oxfam, who has worked in Mosul, briefed us on the situation.
Still more than 1 million people, we believe, trapped inside Mosul. And they're at risk from being caught by sniper fire, from explosive devices. And we're calling on all military actors, that includes ISIS, that includes the Iraqi-led military coalition, to do everything that's possible to provide safe escape routes and to avoid the use of heavy weaponry inside Mosul and built-up areas. And that's to protect people, and that's also to protect civilian infrastructure. And let's not forget that Mosul itself is just the latest phase. in this military operation against ISIS. There's more than 3 million people displaced across northern Iraq. And that's not just from Mosul, that's a number of other areas that have been recaptured in the last few years. And so this is a crisis that's not going to go away anytime soon.
Well, the US-backed operation to liberate Mosul from ISIL did start in October, and now humanitarian agencies are facing major difficulties in getting aid through. The misery of the people trapped there is expected to be aggravated as winter sets in.
The future looks very bleak. It's unlikely that we will be able to return.
We are asking international aid organizations and the government of Iraq to see how we live and to help our districts as quickly as possible. We have nothing left. We have been suffering like this for a long time.
Oxfam's press officer again says it is very important to avoid previous mistakes in the operation of safe routes for civilians.
It's really important that civilians and combatants are distinguished. Several months ago, we saw when civilians tried to leave the conflict zone, they were held up by multiple checkpoints, and sometimes there were reports of people being caught in crossfire, in sniper fire, of their documents being confiscated, and of long delays as well at screening centres, where the army was attempting to ensure that no militants were leaving amongst the civilians. So that's a situation that we have to avoid.
Well, a former director of Israel's intelligence service, Mossad, has discussed the challenges of fighting terror with RT's Sophie Shevardnadze. You will be able to watch their full conversation a bit later today, but here's a preview.
Intelligence is not a science. I believe that intelligence is an art. And therefore, just as there's no orderly way to paint a picture, so is there no orderly way to carry out intelligence.
How do you gain the trust of a radical group? I mean, it must be hard to infiltrate Islamic State, for example.
I'm sure it is difficult to infiltrate the Islamic State, but now you go into the question of motivation. What motivates somebody who is in the Islamic State to cooperate? And I should imagine that probably the major motivation is discussed over the methodology used by the Islamic State, not only in treating its enemies, but also treating some of its own people. But I believe that in the end, in order to achieve the ultimate aim, sometimes along the way you have to do things which normally you would not like to do.